Hey everyone! In this video I'm going to talk about moving beyond simple experiments. And we already talked about experiments in our causal inference primer a couple of weeks ago. And there we talked about experiments as kind of the gold standard for causal inference. Specifically, we talked about randomized experiments where a randomization of the treatment and control group makes both groups ultimately identical to each other on average, so identical with regard to all kind of potential confounding characteristics besides the treatment itself that we're interested in. And this key idea is so central to causal inference because it helps us get around this fundamental problem of causal inference that we cannot observe both the factual and counterfactual outcome of interest for the same observation, essentially, right? So as soon as we have randomization and randomized treatment and control groups, we can assume that the observed outcome in the treatment group and the observed outcome in the control group, that those groups are kind of essentially comparable, and we can look at the difference in the averages in the treatment group and the control group as as our estimated treatment effect, right? So as I mentioned, treatment on control groups, and this is kind of just revisiting one of the slides from our causal inference primer. The treatment and control groups are similar in terms of all both observed and unobserved characteristics, so we can attribute the average differences in outcome to the difference in the treatment and not to any of the potential confounding factors. And we went kind of through this logic using mathematical notation, where we used this potential outcome framework to describe basically outcomes, two types of outcomes, one under control and one under treatment. And if these are independent of the treatment assignment, then we can ultimately express the average treatment effect as the difference between the expectation of all outcomes in the treatment group minus the expectation of all outcomes in the control group, and use that as the difference, or in other words, use the difference in means estimator between the treatment group and control group as the average, as an estimator for the average treatment effect, right? So this is kind of the idea behind simple experiments. We have one treatment group, we have one control group, and we randomize them in order to estimate our treatment effect, right? And so now we're going to talk a little bit about how we can go beyond the simple framework, still using this idea of randomization and still trying to estimate, identify causal effects, but going beyond this simple treatment control comparison, right? But to kind of, before we get to how we can kind of move beyond the simple framework, one thing that is important to emphasize, and that is also mentioned in the bit-by-bit chapter on experiments, is this important difference between the randomized control experiments or randomized control trials, the way I described them in our causal inference prior and just revisited them in the previous slide, and what is also sometimes considered or called experiments, but not in the kind of causal inference framework that we're talking about, which is this so-called perturb and observe experiments, which means not which as opposed to randomized control trials, which I just discussed. That means that that type of experiment is an experiment, is basically or describes the case where we have some intervention, but that intervention is essentially administered to all observations. Or maybe you just have one observation, you then have an intervention, and then you observe what happens after you administer that intervention, right? And so crucially, that is not a sufficient experiment as we think about it for causal inference, because whenever we want to kind of estimate the causal effect of a certain manipulation or intervention, we need a control group. So we need a control group and we need randomization in order to estimate, to reliably estimate treatment effects, right? So those are the key characteristics, but essentially we can go beyond this simple framework where we have just one treatment and one control group, and try to kind of get a better understanding of, for example, underlying mechanisms by examining heterogeneity in treatment effects, and things like that, to move beyond this simple framework, right? There's also a little bit discussion in this chapter on different kind of goals of experiments, and so especially when you look at A/B testing in or ultimately experiments in the industry, where companies are interested in very specific types of kind of optimizations, right? They're ultimately, this example that is mentioned in the book is like, what color should a button have in order for it to be clicked more, or clicked more frequently, or things like that, right? So it's very clear, the ultimately the kind of goal of this experiment is quite clear, right? In social science, of course, it's a little bit more complex, right? The questions, the causal questions that we're asking are often kind of understanding different potential causal mechanisms that ultimately cause a certain behavior, right? But we can think of those as a combination, right? If we're trying to understand what causes a certain behavior, or what causes a certain outcome, ultimately we could think of that as a combination or a comparison of different kind of optimization problems, or different questions where we're just asking, what is the effect of treatment A, what is the effect of treatment B, what is the effect of treatment C, as compared to each other, in order to answer the question, okay, what causes outcome Y in a certain context, right? So ultimately what this means is that the more complex questions that we ask in social science, as compared to sometimes these experiments in the industry, can be thought of as a combination of multiple smaller experiments that compare different types of treatments in order to answer this more complex question, kind of understanding why, or understanding the cause of a certain outcome. Okay. All right. Another important distinction when it comes to kind of experiments and classifying different types of experiments is kind of traditionally, we thought of experiments as kind of being on the continuum between lab experiments and field experiments, where lab experiments are very controlled environments. The classic psychological lab experiments are basically consist of researchers inviting students to come to the lab, answering certain questions, or participating in an experiment with certain manipulations, and then kind of estimating a treatment effect based on whatever manipulation you administered, right? So obviously that has some advantages with regard to how much control you have over the environment, how good you are in isolating that specific causal effect, the effect of the manipulation. But of course there are concerns about external validity, to what extent you can ultimately extrapolate from your, for example, student population to the broader population, or to what extent the context of the lab can also be extrapolated to other contexts, right? Do people behave differently because they went in a lab and knew that they were being studied? It's kind of this effect, this Hawthorne effect idea, versus outside behavior where people are not aware that they might be monitored, for example, right? So that's kind of the traditional continuum in which experiments have been kind of placed, and either further, like, so lab experiments on the one hand and field experiments on the other hand, where field experiments mean that there's still a randomization and an experimental treatment, a manipulation that is administered for a subset of observations, respondents. But it is not administered in this controlled environment of the lab. It is administered outside in the real world, and potentially even outside of people's direct awareness that they are being studied, right? So one of the examples that we talked about, and that is also discussed in the chapters, for example, like a lot of studies that examine turnout get out the vote messaging, right? So there are experiments that basically just randomly send specific messages to some, and I think there's going to be a paper later in the semester that we're going to look at along these lines. So the idea here is to send out mail messages to turn out people to go to vote, to certain households, but not to other households, and then compare compare turnout rate between households, right? So this is an example of of a field experiment. It's not kind of the environment itself is not fully under control of the researcher, but of course it has more kind of external validity because we're observing actual people's turnout and things like that, right? Now, with kind of the rise of the digital age and big data, there's a new dimension, an additional dimension that kind of differentiates experiments, which is whether the experiment, both with regard to recruitment, administration of the treatment, collection of outcome variables, and all these aspects are happening in an analog, traditional fashion, or are using kind of digital techniques and technology, right? So you could think of this, as I mentioned, with regard to recruitment, whether you're trying to find respondents, participants online, versus students in your class that receive extra credit, for example. Um, but also with regard to administering the treatment, right? You could think of people participating in an experiment online where they interact with each other online, for example, versus the traditional, people filling out a survey, a paper-based survey or something like that. As well as with regard to, of course, outcome measures and things like that, right? So this is an additional dimension that differentiates different types of experiments, and of course these, kind of where your experiment will fall in this kind of two-dimensional grid now depends a lot on your underlying research question, and because ultimately, field experiments versus lab experiments and digital versus analog data collections have advantages and disadvantages. And depending on what your underlying research question is, of course, it can be advantageous to leverage the more realistic environment of a field experiment versus a lab experiment, or the other way around. Okay, so these are important dimensions to kind of keep in mind and think about when you think about, okay, how can I actually go about collecting my data, running my experiment? All right. So just to summarize, how do we move beyond simple experiment in the context of kind of the digital age? There are a couple of different strategies that are important to move kind of beyond this kind of simple framework of just having one treatment and one control group and then just examining whether the treatment worked, so to speak, right? And the first important aspect is heterogeneity of treatment effects. So to what extent are there, and I'm going to show an example in a second, to what extent are there systematic differences with regard to the effectiveness of a manipulation for certain subsets of your sample. For certain people, certain people might be more receptive to your treatment than others, and that can be substantively interesting as well, right? The other aspect to move beyond simple experiment is, of course, to increase external validity, especially when it comes to measuring outcomes. When it comes to kind of moving beyond simple survey responses, but focusing on potentially behavioral outcomes that you can measure online. We've talked about experiments, and we'll talk about an experiment in this in our Q&A session next week that looks at people's behavior on Twitter, for example. So has an outcome that is ultimately behavioral, figuring out how people actually acted after a certain treatment was administered on Twitter, rather than just asking people about their attitudes, or whether they could imagine for example engaging in a certain type of activity, right? So that increases, of course, external validity. The third aspect to move beyond simple experiments is to focus to understand underlying mechanisms, right? And understanding mechanisms and kind of examining how a certain treatment is ultimately mediated, causally mediated, is a really difficult task. It's a really challenging task, but it can be really important for our theoretical understanding to kind of get an idea of how certain manipulations impact people's behavior, for example, right? And the next example that I'm going to show you will kind of illustrate that as well, right? So one way to examine these mechanisms is again to have different types of treatment that are kind of that share certain similarities, but kind of address different or target different underlying mechanisms, and that allows us to get a better a better understanding of what actually is driving the relationship, for example, that we're interested in. So to put all of this into a little bit more context and to provide an explicit example, I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the papers that is also discussed in the Bit by Bit book, which is Schultz et al. 2007. The paper is titled "The Constructive, Destructive, and Reconstructive Power of Social Norms," and this paper is also posted on Canvas. It's not a part of the required readings, but if you want to take a look at that paper, feel free to check it out. The underlying idea is to look at different types of manipulations and interventions that affect people's energy use, and specifically that tries to improve people's energy efficiency and people's willingness to save electricity or reduce their energy consumption, right? And so one of the treatments that the researchers here administered was kind of a social norm treatment that showed people their energy consumption here in kilowatt hours compared to the average neighbor and kind of an efficient, like the subset of efficient neighbors, right? So it kind of, depending on people's actual energy consumption, it kind of showed people, okay, where do they, lie in the distribution of energy consumption, and then ultimately they measured afterwards, after delivering this kind of message, was kind of a door handle, kind of little leaflet that they gave people. They examined, okay, how did that actually affect energy consumption in subsequent months, right? And so the interesting thing here is that when they looked at the baseline effect of this treatment overall, this is now the left panel of this graph, they actually saw no effect whatsoever, right? So relatively large standard errors, and it's pretty clearly zero when we look at change in energy consumption per day a week after delivering this treatment and 3 weeks after delivering the treatment, right? So the simple kind of, did the treatment have an effect, yes or no, ultimately, doesn't really reveal all that much. It basically suggests, okay, it didn't really have an effect, right? But the researchers didn't stop there. They went one step further and examined heterogeneity in treatment effects, right? And so what does that mean in this context? It means that they examined the effect of this treatment depending on pre-treatment energy usage. So to what extent did people respond to this intervention differently depending on whether they used a lot of energy before or used only very little energy before? Because presumably people who wasted electricity before, maybe they were more likely to be made aware of this and then actually tried to change their behavior, right? And so this is kind of what we see on the left hand side, or these two point estimates here are the effect, the change in energy consumption per day for people who prior to receiving this message were above the average in energy consumptions, right? So among people who used a lot of energy prior to receiving this treatment, they actually reduced their energy consumption after receiving this treatment. At least 1 week after the receiving the treatment, 3 weeks after receiving the treatment, this effect is not statistically significant anymore. These are 95% confidence intervals, but at least the pattern is a downward trajectory when it comes to energy consumption. And on the other hand, we see that people who were below the average in their energy consumption, so who kind of like saw a message that said, okay, you actually use less than the average consumer, they actually increased their energy consumption, right? Which is interesting in the sense, in some sense, they kind of like saw kind of the message, okay, presumably suggesting, okay, we're doing enough, maybe we don't have to worry so much about energy savings and the like. Okay. So that's one part, moving beyond heterogeneity, or moving beyond simple treatment effect and exploring heterogeneity. The next part that they are interested in, though, is kind of the underlying mechanism, and in order to kind of explore this underlying mechanism, they added an additional manipulation where they included this kind of emotional messaging that kind of tried to reinforce if people were below the average energy consumption to kind of signal, okay, this was really good and you should, keep doing what you're doing. Presumably to potentially, reduce this kind of counterproductive consequence of this manipulation. Right? And so after changing the treatment that way, we're seeing that the effects. So this is the previous results, just including the descriptive norm and the additional kind of smiley or frowny face is an additional kind of injunctive norm to kind of reinforce that if they're below the average, that's really great. If they're not, that's not so great. And we see the effects for above average energy consumption consumers is still there. It's even significant 3 weeks after the receiving the treatment, right? So that effect is still there, maybe even a little bit more pronounced. But what is more important here is that this kind of the counterproductive effect, that people who were doing well before and now were receiving a message that they were doing well, they did not consume significantly more more energy. Right? So this is a great example of kind of moving beyond the simple framework of experiments, and by one first exploring heterogeneity in treatment effects, just going beyond, did this treatment work versus not. Two, of course, I mean, this study is also high on external validity because their outcome measure is actually, it's a field experiment. The outcome measure is how much energy was actually consumed by households. So they read actually, the electricity meters. So that's also a great example of like a highly externally valid study. And then lastly, by kind of including various like slight variations in this treatment, including this injunctive norm treatment, they also can provide more insights into the underlying mechanism. So this is a great example of moving beyond the simple experimental framework, where you can actually learn much more about the underlying mechanism that you're trying to explore. All right, so in the next video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about different ways to ultimately implement your experiment.